RPZ Update.
Good afternoon. Thank you for letting me speak in English. My German is terrible. But you have the Übersetzung? Yeah. And then if there are questions, Axel will translate. Thank you for coming. Today we'll talk about how understanding first century Judaism not only helps us understand Jesus, but also how this understanding produces good news, Evangelium, good news for both Christians and Jews. So my gratitude again to Wolfgang Kraus, to Axel, to Jan, and to the others who were involved in producing this extraordinary volume. We Jews who wrote the annotations and the essays for the English edition could only have done so because we were initially welcomed by Christians. 75 years ago, a number of Jews, Roman Catholic Christians, Protestant Christians, and others, gathered in Switzerland, and there they developed what became known as the 10 Points of Seligsburg. This was the first post-war international statement that stresses, among other matters, that Jesus, his mother, and his first disciples were all Jews, that Jews at all times and all places cannot be held responsible for the death of Jesus, that the passion of Jesus should not reflect any perpetual guilt on the part of the Jews, and that Jews should not be depicted as cursed by God. And these concerns, developed from the work of the French Jewish historian Jules Isaac, were then echoed in the 1965 conciliar document, Nostra Aetate. Are any of you Roman Catholics? Just checking. Good. And good for the Roman Catholic Church. Because from Nostra Aetate on, subsequently numerous church bodies, Protestant and Catholic on national levels and international levels, have affirmed St. Paul's statement in Romans 11:29 that concerning the Jewish people, the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable, cannot be taken away. So in continuity with these efforts, the German translation of the Jewish annotated New Testament uses the text of Luther's Bible. Luther would have been appalled at this. But the German edition is a marvelous indication of how far we have come from his infamous On the Jews and Their Lies. So in response to Christians who affirmed God's fidelity to the covenant with Israel, and with our enormous gratitude for Christians who resist anti-Semitic teaching and preaching, we Jews were able to write the Jewish annotated New Testament. Indeed, had Christians not shown me this initial grace, I would never have become a New Testament scholar. So granted, it may seem peculiar that I go to an Orthodox synagogue. I am not Orthodox in practice, but I go to an Orthodox synagogue. I have dedicated my life to helping Christians and Jews celebrate both our similarities and our differences. And granted as well, all historians have biases. So I will tell you what my biases are, and then when I start to talk about Jesus, you can determine if I am speaking through my biases or if I am being a careful historian. But I will also note, you can be biased, you could also be right. So here's my agenda. And then after I explain that, I'll talk about Jesus the Jew in the context of first century Jewish history, in terms of prayer and piety and politics and parables, and we'll end with a little bit of interfaith possibility. So in terms of my own background, I was raised in a predominantly Roman Catholic area of Massachusetts. Has anyone been to Boston? Okay, close to Boston. I loved Christmas carols and Christmas trees and Easter bunnies. In the public school system, we sang Christmas carols, and I still think that Silent Night, which we sang, is a much prettier song than I Had a Little Dreidel, which was the Hanukkah song that we always sang. When I was 7 years old, my interest in Christianity became more focused, because that year a little girl said to me on the school bus, "You killed our Lord." "I did not," I responded. "I did not kill anybody. Because if you killed God, you would know." Right? "Yes, you did," she said. "Our priest said so." And this becomes my first lesson in Jewish-Christian relations. I thought that priests have to wear special collars, Roman Catholic priests. And I thought that the reason priests wore these special collars because were the priest to tell a lie, the collar would choke the priest. Now, this is a good idea. So I said, "Is the priest dead?" Because this had to be such a lie, the collar would have choked the priest and he'd die. And she said, "No." So I, being a very logical little girl, reasoned, the priest said I killed God, the collar did not kill the priest, therefore I must be responsible for the death of God. My mother met me at the school bus that afternoon, and I was crying. And my mother said to me, "Why are you crying?" And I said, "Because I killed God." The priest said, "I killed God." So my mother at first assured me that the priest had made a mistake and that God was just fine, which was an enormous relief to me. And then I later learned that she called the local church office to complain. Nostra Aetate, that important Vatican document, had not yet been published. Nostra Aetate was 1965. This was a few years earlier. And because of Nostra Aetate, most of this hateful teaching has stopped. But I heard it, and I initially concluded from my 7-year-old wisdom that the priest had made a translation error. And I know some of you have studied languages, and it's very easy to make a translation error. I went to Hebrew school in the synagogue in the next town. I was learning Hebrew, and I thought, oh, it was a translation error. No one told me the New Testament was written in Greek. But I thought I would find the error, and then I would fix it, and then I would end anti-Semitism. And I'm 7 years old. So I told my parents that I wanted to attend catechism, religious education class with my Catholic friends. And my parents, I had the best parents. My parents, who were very wise, said, "As long as you remember who you are, go, you might learn something. It's good to know about other people's religious traditions." So I had Hebrew school 2 days a week, and then I went to church school the other 2 days a week. I started attending religious education classes in the Catholic Church. The teachers loved me. Why? Because I'm the only 7-year-old who wants to be in religious education class twice a week. And what happened was, I loved it. I never ever heard anything anti-Jewish. Rather, I would hear a gospel story and I would think to myself, that story sounds like what I was hearing in the synagogue. Jesus meets a woman at a well and they talk about marriage. Well, that's John chapter 4. It's Jesus and the Samaritan woman, but it's also Abraham's servant and Rebekah, and it's Moses and Zipporah, and it's especially Jacob and Rachel, because the scene in John's gospel is set at Jacob's well. Jesus tells parables, short stories, but so does Nathan the prophet and Jotam the judge. And I knew from rabbinic literature, post-biblical Jewish literature, that the rabbis are very, very good storytellers. So I thought, Jesus is a good storyteller. Jesus produces food miraculously, and he heals people who are suffering, and he raises the dead. And he reminded me of the prophet Elijah and the prophet Elisha, and rabbinic miracle workers like Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa and Rabbi Honi the circle maker. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, baby Jesus is rescued when King Herod's soldiers kill all the children in Bethlehem. And I immediately thought of Moses, who was rescued when Pharaoh in Egypt ordered the death of all the Hebrew baby boys. And it did not surprise me that Jesus, the rescued baby, would somehow travel to Egypt and cross water in a life-changing experience and face temptation in the wilderness and go up on a mountain and deliver a law, because that's Moses going back to Egypt and going through the Red Sea and going into the wilderness, because Matthew knows the plot. of the book of Exodus. The pattern is already there. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus issues a number of complaints, invectives, against fellow Jews. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. And in one of these woes, he condemns the Pharisees. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, because you like the best seats in the synagogue. And in my synagogue, in my hometown, there was a family that always sat in the best seats. And my mother used to complain. So I'm hearing Jesus complain about Jews, and he sounds like the prophet Amos, and he sounds like the prophet Hosea, and he sounds exactly like my mother. He's a Jew complaining about other Jews. So I could not figure out where the problem was. Several years later, I sat down and read the New Testament. And then I found out where the problems are. Parts of it were familiar, parts of it were very painful. Matthew chapter 27, verse 25, the cry of all the people. The Greek is paso laos. Anyone here speak Hebrew? The Hebrew would have been kol ha'am. All the people say his blood be on us and on our children. And so I learned how all Jews from all generations came to be blamed for the death of Jesus. Or John chapter 8, verse 44, where Jesus refers to the Jews. The Greek term is judaioi. Jesus says to the Jews, you are children of the devil. And twice in the United States, I have been asked by elderly Protestant ladies when I had my horns removed. I'm quite serious, because they had read the Gospel of John and they had seen Michelangelo's statue with the horns on Moses, and they had never met a Jew. So of course I must have had my horns removed. They were very relieved to find out that I did not have horns. This is not anti-Semitism, this is ignorance. John chapter 20 recounts, the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews. And so I realized that the Gospel of John equates the Jews with the devil, and it separates Jesus and his followers from all those Jews. And then there's Acts chapter 3, where Peter says, men Israelites, which really means you Jews, not only have you rejected the holy and righteous one and asked to have a murderer given to you, but you Jews, you killed the author of life. And then came 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 with its notice about the Jews who killed the Lord Jesus, and problems continue up to the book of Revelation, which twice mentions a synagogue of Satan. So reading the New Testament, one can easily conclude that it was the Jews, the entire Jewish people, and not just Pontius Pilate and his Roman soldiers, who killed Jesus, and so it is the entire Jewish community that is damned. However, when I read the New Testament, two other things occurred to me, and these are my biases. The first thing I realized is that we choose how to read. Today we would call this hermeneutics. We choose how to read. My Christian friends and teachers read these same verses, but they did not hate me. Rather, they modeled love of God and love of neighbor. So I thought, we can choose to read the Bible in a way that promotes love and compassion and not bigotry and hatred. So I have spent my life teaching Christians how to find messages of love without proclaiming a message of hate for Jews and Judaism. That's my primary bias. I don't want the Christian gospel to become a text of hate. I will also note that I work with Jews to make sure that they do not have anti-Christian views, because there are problems on both sides. Second, I realized that the New Testament is Jewish history. Jesus was a Jew, as were all the Marys. Mary, his mother, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the sister of Martha, Mary, the mother of John Mark, they're all Jews. Peter is Jewish, Paul is Jewish, Stephen is Jewish, Philip is Jewish. In the synagogue, when I was growing up, we learned about ancient Israel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and we learned Jewish history up to the Maccabees, the Hanukkah story. Ironically, we learned about the Maccabees from later rabbinic literature, but the church kept the book of the Maccabees. So the Roman Catholic Church, the Orthodox churches, they have the books of the Maccabees in their Bible. We Jews, we got the holiday of Hanukkah. The Christians have the books. We have the holiday. I'm okay with that. But in the synagogue, we went from the Maccabees in the 2nd century BCE to the Mishnah in the early 3rd century Common Era. We missed the entire first century. We never talked about the New Testament. But the New Testament is a wonderful source of Jewish history. The Gospels tell us a great deal about first century Jewish life in the Galilee and in Judea. For example, Jesus is the first person in literature ever to be called rabbi. The only Pharisee from whom we have written records is Paul of Tarsus. The Gospels give us one of our earliest examples of naming a baby boy at a bris, a ritual circumcision. And the book of Acts gives us one of our earliest examples of naming David the author of Psalms that do not claim Davidic authorship. So the more I studied the New Testament, the better Jew I became, because the New Testament not only provides insight into Jewish history, it also preserves Jewish teachings. Jesus' teaching about the kingdom of heaven, about righteousness, about love of God and love of neighbor, they're thoroughly Jewish. He's a Jewish teacher who has much to teach us. So whereas I do not worship the messenger, I appreciate and I am challenged by, and I am even inspired by much of his message. But here's the problem. The distorted messages, like that little girl who told me that I had killed God, some of those distorted messages still continue. The issue today is less among well-meaning Christians, the idea that the Jews killed Jesus. But problems do continue, and hatred of Judaism is still being proclaimed in churches, Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox, across the globe. In numerous books and homilies, sermons, especially by historically uninformed theologians, Jesus' Jewish background serves to epitomize what is wrong with the world. If Jesus preaches good news to the poor, so the common impression goes, the Jews must be proclaiming good news to the rich. If Jesus welcomes sinners, then the Jews must be pushing them away. If Jesus speaks to or heals a woman, the Jews promote a patriarchal society that makes the Taliban in Afghanistan look progressive. And if Jesus is the pedagogue of the oppressed, then Judaism must be the oppressor. So why should we, both Jews and Christians, look at Jesus within his own context? Beyond recovering our mutual history and understanding how we came to separate, here's one example among many as to why it is essential that we locate Jesus within Judaism. Because if we do not locate Jesus within Judaism, bad teaching will continue. I think the problem here is not anti-Semitism. I think it's ignorance. But the result, the promotion of Jew hatred, will happen nonetheless. Here's my example. It is from a Baptist from Benin in Africa. This is one of many examples I found in publications by the World Council of Churches. And here is what this author said. Jesus died as the result of the clash between his God with a capital letter G and the God, lowercase g, of Pharisaic Judaism. But alas, Christianity has fallen back to the patriarchal God of Judaism with even greater zeal. The God of the clan will sanctify anything, including militarism, war, sexism, apartheid, as long as it serves the interests of the clan. So a few years ago, I documented publications by the World Council of Churches regarding Jews and Judaism, and then I presented the material at a meeting of the International Council of Christians and Jews. At that meeting was a representative of the World Council of Churches, which is why I gave the paper there. The first representative said the comments that I cited were not representative of the organization. And I said, well, I agree, they go against World Council of Churches guidelines. But the fact that I found about 25 or 30 such examples suggests that people are not following the guidelines. And then another person said that anti-Judaism was not intended. And I agreed, it probably was not intended. But regardless of intent, the negative effect was still there. And then I was accused of silencing the previously voiceless because I cited people from Africa and East Asia and South Asia and the former communist bloc in Eastern Europe. But I've also cited people from England and Australia and the United States. So if somebody is previously voiceless but then says material that's anti-Jewish, I said, I thought they would do well to keep quiet. I was not at my charitable best. A month later, the World Council of Churches Press called me to ask if they could publish my article. They asked me if I could write guidelines for the press, and I did. But the problem is that those earlier publications are still on library shelves across the globe. So we need to understand Jesus within Judaism to counter some of this unfortunate teaching, which is still with us. So let's look at Jesus the Jew and see what we find and see why we would care. First, he dresses like a Jew. Even to the wearing of, the Hebrew would be tzitzit, the Greek is krasbedon, fringes. Because it's these fringes that the woman with the hemorrhage reaches out to touch in hopes that she can get a healing. And these fringes are designed to remind the wearer of all the commandments. We can see this in the book of Numbers. When Jesus in Matthew chapter 23 complains that the Pharisees made their fringes broad, we can conclude that his were less ostentatious. His were narrow. To take this to the practical conclusion, Jesus does not dismiss the Torah. To use the modern idiom, he wears the law and the prophets on his sleeve. And this point should help Christians recover the value of the Old Testament, which is a good term for Christians to use. Next, he eats like a Jew. That is, he does not eliminate the dietary regulations. He was correct in saying it's not what goes into the mouth that makes one unclean, since eating does not function the same way other purity laws do, because generally purity is a matter that's temporary and you can get out of impurity, like menstruation or childbirth. But Jesus does not do away with the dietary regulations. Food may not make us impure, but we still don't have pork. Side note, Nürnberger sausage is very good. I had some for lunch. Had Jesus eliminated dietary concerns, there would have been much less to talk about at the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15. So to a practical conclusion, he was, as a Jew, committed to the idea of the sanctification of the body. He attended to what went into it and what came out of it. Indeed, Jesus shows such enormous respect for the mitzvot, the commandments, that he debates with other Jews on how they are best to be understood. For example, and I chose this example because it's something Jews and Christians share, Jesus honors the Sabbath and keeps it holy. The Sabbath is something that Jews and Christians share, although we celebrate it on different days and for different reasons. Judaism celebrates the Sabbath, Hebrew Shabbat, Yiddish Shabbos, because this is the day that God blessed after the work of creation, so this is the day of rest, and because we were slaves in Egypt, and the Sabbath guarantees that we will never be enslaved again. So the church, who liked the idea of a day of rest, shifted from celebrating on the last day of the week, Saturday, to the first day of the week, Sunday, to commemorate the resurrection of Jesus, and also to begin that separation from the Jewish community. Now, some of my students think of Judaism as a myriad of thousands of picky injunctions, and that we Jews worry that if we break one of them, we'll face the wrath of an angry God. And of course, this view of Judaism makes all Jews hopelessly sanctimonious, obsessive, and neurotic, except for Jesus, who declares the Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. That's Mark 2:27. But this is a wrong view of Judaism. How do Jews honor the Sabbath and keep it holy? Well, rabbinic texts, both post-biblical Jewish texts, make the same points Jesus made. The Talmud, this is Yoma 85b, interprets, the Sabbath is given to you, you are not delivered to the Sabbath. And this sounds very much like Jesus' comment, the Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. So Jesus heals people on the Sabbath. Was healing forbidden? Not at all. There is no law that says thou shalt not heal miraculously on the Sabbath, which would be silly. And that's why when Jesus does do healings in the synagogues, the congregation typically gives praise to God rather than accuses him of violating the law. We also learn from these scenes, by the way, that free health care is a miracle. So we pay attention to that. In terms of epitomizing or summarizing the teachings of his tradition, Jesus is fully in line with other Jewish teaching. Rabbi Hillel, one of Judaism's greatest teachers and a slightly older contemporary of Jesus, was once asked by a potential follower, "Teach me the Torah. Teach me all of your traditions, your values, your practices, and your theology while standing on one foot." Teach me everything while standing on one foot. And Hillel wisely responds, what is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. All the rest is commentary, go and learn. And a few decades later, Jesus instructs, in everything do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law and the prophets. This is where you start. That's not where you stop, because Jesus will cite other commandments elsewhere. In Jewish liturgy, anybody Jewish or knows Jewish liturgy? Okay, this may sound familiar. In Jewish liturgy, we recite a prayer called the Ve'ahavta, from its first word, you shall love. Ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha u'b'chol nafshecha u'b'chol me'odecha. You will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And we read from the Torah in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The great Rabbi Akiva, another Jewish teacher killed by the Romans about a century after Jesus, stated, love your neighbor as yourself. This is the major principle of Torah. This is from the Jerusalem Talmud. So too, when defining which commandment in the law is the greatest, Jesus responds, Ve'ahavta, you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. That's Matthew 22, 37 to 40. As far as his other teaching is concerned, Jesus evokes the prophets and the rabbis in his parables. Parables, it's a genre well known to his fellow Jews. So how do we hear a parable? Parables should help us see the world anew and challenge our presuppositions, or in the modern idiom, take us out of our comfort zones. So I've already noted Jesus' evocation of Leviticus, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The context in which this verse appears in the Gospel of Luke, four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, yeah? Oh, good, Christians, yeah. The context in which it appears in Luke's Gospel provides the introduction to the parable of the Good Samaritan. Luke describes a lawyer who asks Jesus, who is my neighbor? This is actually a very good question, because groups have to have boundaries. For example, who can take communion or participate in Eucharist in this particular church? Who can say a prayer in my synagogue? Who can vote in your elections? So we need to know who's in and who's out. One of the Jewish questions at the time of Jesus was, were Samaritans in or out? And for some Jews, they were in, and for other Jews, they were out. They were a very good test case. So in Jewish tradition, Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor, really does mean love fellow members of your community, fellow Jews. But this love was never restricted to Jews. Leviticus 19:34, the same chapter, mandates, you shall love the stranger who dwells among you, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And the Torah, moreover, mandates care for society's vulnerable, the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, or today we might say, the immigrant. So the question, who is my neighbor, is a good question. There are, however, better questions. So Jesus refuses to answer the lawyer directly. Instead, he responds with a parable, describing how a man is waylaid by bandits and left for dead. And a priest, if this were in Hebrew, the term would be Kohen, a priest, walks by, as does a Levite, but the person who stops to help is a Samaritan. Unless we see this parable as a Jewish story, we will miss the point of the parable. The priest and the Levite are not, contrary to one popular interpretation, required by Jewish law to avoid contact with a corpse. I have heard this in numerous sermons. Jewish law insists not only on the saving of a life, but if the fellow were dead, on burying his corpse. And we know that in part from the book of Tobit, which was preserved by the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, but not by the Jews. The Mishnah in Tractate Nazir, chapter 7, insists that even high priests bury unattended corpses, and nor is the priest on his way up to the temple where purity would be an issue. The Greek is katabino, the priest is going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, so purity would not be a problem. The best explanation I heard for why the priest and the Levite passed by the fellow in the ditch came from the American civil rights worker, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And here's what King suggests. It's possible, said King, these men, the priest and the Levite, were afraid. The priest and the Levite asked themselves, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? Because there were bandits on the road. But a Samaritan asks a different question. The Samaritan asks, if I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? And then King goes on to say, if I do not stop to help the sanitation workers in Memphis, this was a strike of black sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, about 3 hours from where I live. If I do not stop to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to them? King stopped to help, and he was assassinated while he was there because there were bandits on the road. So both priest and Levite failed to follow the law, and they failed to help a fellow child of God. But so why a priest and a Levite? Because Jewish people generally divide into three groups. Priests, who are descended from Moses' brother Aaron. If you meet a Jewish person whose last name is Cain or Khan or Kohen, probably from the priestly line. And the second group are Levites, Aaron's ancestors, descended from Jacob's son Levi, the son number 3. So if you meet a Jewish person whose last name is Levison or Lev or Lewis or Levine, you've probably got a Levite. And everyone else is an Israelite. So Jews know if you say priest, Levite, the third one is Israelite. But that's not how the parable goes. To go from priest to Levite to Samaritan is like going from father to son to Satan. It's unthinkable. Samaritans and Jews living next door to each other, sharing a common ancestry, having similar Bibles, worshiping the same God, were also enemies. Josephus, a first century Jewish historian, notes that Samaritans were harassing Jews going from Galilee in the north to Jerusalem in the south. So at the time of Jesus, relations between Samaritans and Jews were difficult. The Gospel of John tells us that Jews and Samaritans don't get along. And in the Gospel of Luke, one chapter before our parable, because Luke is a very good writer, Jesus, going from Galilee in the north to Judea in the south, stops at a Samaritan village and is looking for hospitality. And the Samaritans refuse him hospitality because he's a Jew going down to Jerusalem. And at this point, two of the apostles, James and John, say to Jesus, Lord, shall we call down fire from heaven and destroy this village? And Jesus has to respond that bombing a village is not an appropriate response to lack of hospitality. So what happens in the parable? At the end of the parable, Jesus reframes the lawyer's question. The more important question is not who is my neighbor, but how do neighbors act? Who acted as neighbor? To get a sense of the urgency and the edginess of this parable, all we have to do is put it into 21st century terms and ask, where is Samaria? Samaria today is the West Bank. So here's what the parable says today. I'm an Israeli Jew going down the Jerusalem to Jericho road, and I am waylaid by robbers and beaten and left half dead. And two people who should have stopped to help don't. A member of the Israeli Defense Force who walks by, or a member of Christian Witness for Peace who walks by, but the person who stops to help is a Palestinian Muslim member of Hamas, which is an organization dedicated to Israel's destruction. If we could just imagine that, maybe we could get somewhere in the Middle East. When we extend Jesus' teachings from single line to prayer, we also find continuity with Judaism. So you know the Our Father prayer, yes? Christians? Good. The problem with the Our Father prayer is that, like the Good Samaritan, it's become domesticated, it's too familiar. In the public school system in the United States in the early 1960s, my first grade teacher told me to fold my hands like this and bow my head, and the entire first grade class said the Our Father prayer. I thought it was a Jewish prayer. I was right. Who knew? It never occurred to me that this was a Christian prayer because it doesn't say anything about Jesus. So let's start, right? So if you just start, Our Father who is in heaven, yeah? The our is important because it suggests the idea of community. Many Jewish prayers are in the plural because you pray as a community. You don't pray alone. Jews typically call God Father. We can see this in the prophet Malachi. Have we not all one Father? So following the German New Testament scholar Gerhard Kittel, who was also a member of the Nazi Party, the German scholar Joachim Jeremias many years ago suggested that Jesus' use of the term Abba, which is not in the Our Father prayer, it's in Mark, the Gethsemane scene in Mark 14, and twice in Paul, is an intimate address meaning something like daddy or papa, and Jews would have thought that this was blasphemous to call God Abba. Well, it turns out he was wrong. And he actually retracted the view. He called it a piece of inadmissible naivete, which does sound better in German. The following is my favorite rabbinic use of the term Abba. It comes from the Babylonian Talmud, tractate Ta'anit 23b, but the figures are from the 1st century before Jesus. And here's the story. Honi the circle maker, one of these miracle workers, had a daughter who had a son who was called Hanan HaNegba. And when the world was in need of rain, the sages would send school children to him. And they would take hold of the hem of his garment and they would tug on it. And they would say, Abba, Abba, Father, Father, give us rain. And then Hanan HaNegba would plead with the Holy One, Baruch Hu, blessed be he, Master of the universe, do it for the sake of these little ones who don't know the difference between an Abba who can give rain and an Abba who can't. The prayer also offers more than piety. It also concerns politics, because the Caesars, the Roman emperors, gave themselves a number of titles. They called themselves God, they called themselves Son of God, they called themselves Savior, and you could see with the Emperor Augustus, he also liked to call himself Father. So when Jews pray, and when Jesus prays, Our Father, the one who is in heaven, that may be a political statement. Our Father is the one who reigns in heaven, not on the throne of Rome. It's politics. Hallowed be your name. Jews have been hallowing the divine name, which is ineffable, it's unpronounceable, since Moses has a conversation with a burning bush. And the voice from the bush tells Moses, go to Pharaoh, who's the ruler in Egypt, and demand freedom from the Israelites who are enslaved. And Moses, quite properly, asks the name of the God who issues this command. In other words, it's been 400 years, what's your name? And if God had said, my name is Wolfgang, or my name is Jutta, everything would have been fine. But instead, God says, Ehiyah asher ehiyah, I will be what I will be. The name of God is an imperfect, irregular verb. So terms like Yahweh or Jehovah, they're just attempts to pronounce what cannot be pronounced. So this making sacred of God's name is a component of many Jewish prayers, especially the Kaddish prayer, which begins, Yit Gadal, V'yit Kadash, Shemei Rabbah, magnified and sanctified be God's great name. And even more important, that prayer is not in Hebrew, it's in Aramaic, which is the language that Jesus spoke. Your kingdom come. Well, traditional Judaism speaks of the Olam Haba, the world to come, which is a time marked by universal peace. Also, by the way, by resurrection of the dead. We do have an idea of heaven, But contrary to what a number of my Christian students think, we don't think we earn our way into heaven. Heaven is simply part of the covenant. It's a gift of grace. Your will be done. Jesus helps people understand divine will by doing what Rabbinic Judaism calls building a fence about the law. This is from the rabbinic document, Pirkei Avot, chapter 1, verse 1. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus does not offer antitheses. Those would be opposites. Jesus rather offers extensions. To those who heard it said, "You shall not murder," Jesus says, if you're angry with a brother or sister, you're liable to judgment. And that's building a fence about the law. Because if you're not angry, you're less likely to murder. To those who said, "You shall not commit adultery," Jesus says, don't think about it. Because if you don't think about it, you're less likely to do it. Regarding purity laws concerning matters such as menstruation and childbirth and the treatment of corpses, Jesus does not do away with them. To the contrary, he restores people to states of ritual purity. That hemorrhaging lady who reached out to grab his fringes, he literally dries her up. She will never bleed again. He cleanses people suffering from leprosy. He raises the dead to life. That's taking people from states of impurity and restoring to them purity. Give us this day our daily bread sounds to me redundant. Think, give us this day our bread? Fine. Give us our daily bread? Fine. Give us this day our daily bread? That's repetitive. And the problem here is the Greek that we translate daily, epiousion. We actually don't know what it means. But we have a hint of this. Many Jewish texts portray heaven as a great banquet. What do we do in the world to come? We eat. That's why, by the way, Jesus keeps eating. He eats his way through the Gospels. 5,000 people, 4,000 people dining with sinners and tax collectors, dining with Pharisees. I think Jesus was a little chubby because he eats a lot. My friends tell me he walked a lot too, but I think he was a little chubby. Because when you dine with Jesus, that's as if you're in the kingdom of God at that heavenly banquet, right? So perhaps the original Aramaic beneath the Greek was, give us tomorrow's bread today. Bring about that full heavenly kingdom where we can recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because that's the prophetic hope. But the prayer also means, dear Father, please give us enough food to get us through the day so that we and our children will not starve. And thus we are reminded that not everybody has daily bread. As for forgive us our trespasses or sins or debts, and these are different words. Matthew has debt, Luke has sin. Which is it? Well, the same Aramaic word, the word is chov or chobah, underneath can be translated sin or debt or trespass. By the time of Jesus, sin had come to be understood less as a weight that needs to be lifted off and more as a stain that needs to be washed clean or a debt that needs to be repaid to God. So what did Jesus intend with the Aramaic term? So my first thought was that Jesus intended forgive us our debts. That's Matthew, that's the Sermon on the Mount. And the call is for economic justice for the Jubilee year when all debts are forgiven. As the prophet Habakkuk puts it, alas for you who heap up what is not your own, how long will you load yourself with goods taken in pledge? So I thought it was forgive us our debts, and then the church started to forgive sin. So the church changed it. But sometimes you learn new things. Before COVID, I taught regularly at Riverbend Maximum Security Institute. It's a men's prison where Tennessee's death row is located because some states in the United States still engage in capital punishment. So I would bring Vanderbilt Divinity students out to the prison and we would meet with insider students, and these would be regular classes. So my first course that I taught out there was a course on the Gospel of Matthew. Why? Because Matthew has a parable about visiting people in prison. So I thought, check that one out. And we get to the Sermon on the Mount, and I suggested that Jesus originally spoke about economic debt, And I also suggested that it was easier to forgive a sin than a debt. If you sin against me, I can forgive you. But if you owe me 100,000 euros, I want the money. So it's easier to forgive a sin than a debt. And one of my Riverbend students, in prison for multiple murder, then talked about participating in a program of restorative justice and of how he had met with the family members of the people he killed. And they had eventually said to him, "We forgive you." And then he looked at me and he said, "Lady, you do not understand sin. And because you do not understand sin, you cannot understand forgiveness." And what they had offered him in forgiving him was worth more than any economic debt could ever be worth. So what did Jesus intend? I think he meant both. To people who had when others needed, he said, "Give without expectation of return," because that's what family members do, and that's generosity. But to other people who had asked for forgiveness, it's your job to say, "Yes, I can reciprocate," and still be in that community. And finally, just a brief note on salvation, because salvation has become a stumbling block for Jewish-Christian relations. In the Gospel of John, chapter 14, Jesus states, "I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by me." And consequently, many Christians claim that the only way to get to heaven is through worshiping Jesus. And that's a plausible reading of John's Gospel. The original context of the verse is actually in response to a question raised by the apostle named Thomas. Thomas asked Jesus, "Show us the way." And it's possible that Thomas is a cipher for some of those followers of Jesus who thought that Jesus had special knowledge, the Greek would be gnosis, that would allow people to be saved or to get to heaven. The mysteries that he would unveil to them would allow them to achieve their own salvation. But the Gospel of John insists that salvation is not based on secret teachings. It's based on Jesus' fidelity to divine will by dying on behalf of humanity. As John the Baptist says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." So Thomas wants the route to his own path to salvation, and Jesus says, "I am the way. You get to salvation by my cross, not by your intellect." But what about that passage today? Well, so far everything I've done has been history. But now I'm going to talk about salvation. So that's in the future, not the past. This I made up. See if this works for you. After a very, very long and happy life, I die. I arrive at heaven, and St. Peter is there to welcome me. And I have questions like, can you speak Greek? And can you read? And what happened to your wife? And who won the fight that you had with Paul in Antioch, right? So lots of questions. And Peter says, "Not now. This is not the time for questions. We can have a chat after dinner." This really is for a Bible scholar heaven. But get your wings and your halo at the next table, and we'll talk later. Now, there's a line, because there's always a line, but it moves quickly, because this is heaven. And standing behind me in a line is a conservative Christian preacher who is noticeably upset. And he begins to call out, "Peter, I'm sorry to cause trouble my first day in heaven, but I do not understand how this Jew," he points to me, "is here in heaven. She's not baptized. She doesn't worship Jesus as Lord. She doesn't believe in the Trinity. So how is she in heaven?" And Peter responds, "Wait here." Actually, Peter said, "Oi Gewalt." Wait here. And I, of course, stay to watch. So Peter shortly returns with a man with very dark eyes that look like they're reaching into your very soul. The man has holes in his wrists and on his feet. And now I have questions like, can you speak Greek? But this is not the time. So Jesus asks the man, "What is your concern?" And the man says, "Lord, did you not say in the Gospel of John that no one could come to the Father except through you? And now this Jew," he points at me, "is in heaven. I do not understand." So Jesus looks at him and loves him and explains. The Gospel of John does have me say this. But if you turn to the Gospel of Matthew, which does come first in the canon, I make it very clear that it's not those who say, Lord, Lord, but those who do the will of my Father, like feeding the hungry and welcoming the stranger. Oh, and visiting people in prison. My daughter Amy Jill, he says, has done the best she can with the talents that she's been given. But Lord, the man explains, that's works righteousness. You're saying she earned her way into heaven. But salvation is supposed to be a free gift. And Jesus sighs, and he instructs the man to return to John chapter 14. And Jesus says, as John chapter 14 states, I am the way. I am the way, not you. Not your narrow sense of grace. I say she gets in. Do you want to argue? And the last thing I recall seeing before I go off to find my halo and my slippers is Jesus handing the man a handkerchief to help get the log out of his eye. So if the Christian wants to proclaim salvation through the Christ, then I suggest that the Jesus I know from history, the Jewish Jesus, would be infinitely more concerned about how I loved my neighbor as myself and how I loved the stranger and how I cared about those in need than the details of my belief, since belief is not something one can control. My heart is completely filled with Judaism. I don't feel an emptiness. But from Jesus, I feel a challenge. So to conclude, Jesus dresses like a Jew. He eats like a Jew. He prays like a Jew. He teaches like a Jew. He instructs other Jews on halakha. Halakha is Jewish practice. It comes from the Hebrew word holech, which means to walk or to go. And by the way, the church adopts the idea of halakha. According to the book of Acts, the early followers of Jesus did not call themselves Christians. They called themselves followers of the way. And the Greek term for way is hodos. It's where we get the English word odometer. It's a kilometer indicator. It's the path that you follow. It's halakha in Greek. So if we teach how Jesus lived and died as a Jew, we will at the very least make life difficult for neo-Nazis. And I'm happy with that. If we're better able to understand his teachings, we'll do much good in fostering Jewish-Christian relations, because Christians will come to appreciate the depth of Jesus' life within its Jewish context. And Jews, I hope, will come to recognize Jesus as one of ours. To achieve these goals, we Christians and Jews might imagine ourselves as cars traveling next to each other, the car of halakha and the car of hodos, each moving in the same direction on the Autobahn. So when we look with only narrow vision at what is immediately in front of us or behind us, we see parallel lanes. But if you look at roads that are very long on the horizon, those roads meet. We can call this an optical illusion. I prefer to call it God's eye view. When we look at those two roads way in the past, 2,000 years in the past, before the cross, we have Jesus the Jew talking to other Jews. There is no separation. But I think if we look far in the future, when the Messiah comes or comes back, when we have that messianic age, I think those cars of halakha and hodos pull into the same station, because Jews and Christians are worshiping the same God, the one who created the heaven and the earth. And I think at that point, those parallel lines meet. So we Jews and Christians, we travel on separate but parallel lanes. But I am confident that eventually we pull into the same rest stop, because the God of Israel is the God of Jesus. We need to listen to each other. The floor is now yours, and thank you very much for journeying with me.